And I'm Janet Sarbanes. I teach in A&P. The series as a whole explores solidarity as a kind of power from below, examining the relations between individuals and collectives and subgroups in society that solidarity makes possible, its affective dimensions, and its key role in generating and sustaining forms of struggle, historically and in the current moment. It also explores the role of art in generating solidarity, and we will have 3 of our 6 speakers are artists, and how artists relate to communities and community actions. Our speakers will explore themes such as migrant social movements, Black feminism, performance art, social practice, social ecology, municipalism, art for and by political prisoners, AIDS, artivism, tenants' rights, organizing, and what it would mean and how it could transform society to have solidarity with children. We encourage you to join us in person, but all talks will be available by Zoom as well. The format for today and going forward will be a presentation by our speaker, followed by a discussion in person and by Zoom, and then a short break. And at that point, the Zoom portion will conclude, and we'll move into more of a seminar type format. Everyone's welcome, who's here is welcome to stay for that as well. I'm so glad to introduce as our first speaker, Chris Zepeda-Millán. Chris is an award-winning author and associate professor in the Department of Public Policy and Chicana and Central American Studies at UCLA, with additional appointments in poli-sci, labor studies, and sociology. He is also the chair of Labor Studies, a new program that you all may be interested in hearing about, and the founding faculty director of the UCLA Strategic Research Lab, which is a capacity building training hub and network for applied researchers from labor and other social movements. So he's doing all of that, and he's also written 2 really important books and a lot of other stuff. His books include, more recently, Walls, Cages, and Family Separation, Immigration Policy in the Time of Trump, and the award-winning Latino Mass Mobilization, Immigration, Racialization, and Activism, which we'll be hearing about today. And I feel it's really a must-read for understanding our own moment and sort of what is possible from a social movement perspective in this time. And in reading it, I was really struck by how attentive Chris is in his fieldwork to the voices of non-traditional leaders and activists. It fleshes out the social movement picture in meaningful new ways, and sort of really gives us a perspective on how to grow solidarity. So that's it for me. Please welcome Chris.
Thank you, Janet. I was a little hesitant and intimidated to accept the invitation. I've never spoken at an art school before. My wife, though, as I was telling Janet, is a world arts and culture major at UCLA decades ago. And she promised me that you all would be much more interesting than my boring public policy students. So I said, okay, let's do it. What I want to do today is talk about a little bit about my first book. And I want to then zero in on one particular chapter because I think it has a lot to say about the difficulties of organizing and building solidarity across different forms of identities, different types of identities. But after that, we could talk about the current moment. I'll tell you a little bit about some of the other chapters of the book, and I'd be happy to answer any questions about that as well. I think some of you may be too young to remember, but in the spring of 2006, from Alaska to North Carolina and Arizona to Massachusetts, the historic immigrant rights mobilizations that took place really captured the nation's attention with a series of mass demonstrations and an array of forms of dissent, ranging from hunger strikes and caravans to boycotts and candlelit prayer vigils. Mothers and fathers, children and grandparents, both undocumented immigrants and US-born citizens, they took to the streets to protest the Border Protection, Anti-Terrorism, and Illegal Immigration Control Act, which is a mouthful, was more commonly known as HR 4437, or simply the Sensenbrenner Bill. Now, among its most punitive provisions, the bill sought to increase the penalty of being undocumented from a civil violation to a federal felony. If it had become law, people who helped immigrants in the most basic ways would have also been punished with thousands of dollars of fines and even potentially be jailed. right? And this could have criminalized everyone from priests, social workers, and teachers, to unions, employers, and even the family members of undocumented immigrants. So for example, if my undocumented grandmother needed a ride to a doctor's appointment and I was giving her a ride and we were to be pulled over, not only would she immediately get sent to detention and deported, but I'd also go to jail and fined thousands of dollars because I would be considered quote unquote harboring an undocumented immigrant, right? So it's a pretty draconian and punitive bill. The protest wave culminated in two of the largest episodes of collective action in American history, when up to 5 million people in almost every state in the country took part in close to 400 demonstrations and 2 national days of action, which I'm realizing are a little blurry here, but basically from February to May of 2006, you see here in blue are the number of protests that occurred, and then in red are the size, the 2 big ones, right? So the 2 big peaks here are the April 10th National Day of Action for Immigrant Justice, and the May 1st, the official name was the Great American Boycott, but it was known in the media as the Day Without an Immigrant. To give you a sense of the geographic scope of the demonstrations, you see, right, this is really important because usually Latino activism in the US historically has been pretty geographic specific, right? So the Chicano movement happened in the Southwest, Puerto Rican activism was really kind of New York and Chicago. Cuban activism has pretty much been around the Miami, Florida area. This was the first kind of pan-ethnic Latino social movement, right? And you see here, again, sure, you had major demonstrations in California and New York, but everywhere there was a demonstration. And the only 2 states I wasn't able to document a protest was in Hawaii, which I'm pretty sure something happened there. I got to find it. And North Dakota, which I'll give it to them. Maybe something didn't happen there, right? But again, it was a real national protest wave, which had never happened in Latino political history. And these are also not only the largest immigrant rights mobilizations in U.S. history, but the largest ones in world history. Our country has never seen this level of mobilization from their foreign populations before. These mass mobilizations were surprising not only because the United States had not seen the likes of them since the civil rights and anti-war movements of the 1960s and 70s, but also because of who was demonstrating. Although protests are often considered to be a form of politics used by the most marginalized members of societies, according to several quantitative studies on political participation in the United States, due to a supposed lack of resources and civic skills, it's actually not the poor or racial minorities, but white middle class and American citizens who are the most likely to be both targeted for politics and the most likely to participate in both electoral politics and voting, right? And again, when we think of BLM or the civil rights movement, we think like, okay, it's usually people of color protesting, but the census data, survey after survey, tells us that the vast majority of people who participate tend to be people of higher socioeconomic status. And when you think about it, it makes sense, right? Working class, poor people of color don't get the day off often, right? If they do have a day off, it's the one day they want to spend with their families. And we could talk about more about that literature later. Yeah, in the spring of 2006, it was immigrants of color and their families, the vast majority of which who were Latinos, who were the ones demonstrating. Now, this is particularly interesting given that Latino immigrant communities are usually portrayed as being poor and under-resourced, and not surprisingly, given what we know about the relationship between socioeconomic status and political participation, scholars had continuously found that Latinas and Latina immigrants in particular were amongst the least likely to participate in activism in the United States. Many social movement theorists were equally baffled by the marches, given that the dominant paradigms in this literature, which had traditionally relegated grievances to secondary factors, could also not completely explain these series of mass marches. At the time that they were happening, I was a graduate student at Cornell with Sidney Terrell, one of the big social movement theorists, and they had these meetings, and none of the big social movement theories could explain what was happening. They're just like, we don't know how to explain this. This is very unpredictable. For example, resource mobilization theorists have long argued that the presence of what they call social movement organizations and that resources from external actors, such as foundations or bigger, well-funded national organizations, are vital for collective action to take place. In addition, social movement scholars from the political process school agree on the importance of organizations, but they argue that it's actually what they call the confluence of an expanding political opportunity structure, often measured by things such as which political party is in office or what current public opinion on an issue is, that are also key to the mass mobilization and movement building processes. Well, in 2006, these demonstrations seemed to complicate these theories, given that the protests happen in unlikely places, as I showed with the map, right? Places like the rural US South, places with no established history of immigrant activism, and without the existence of professional social movement organizations. I'm going to discuss this issue again using the case of New York, chapter 4. As a reminder, why New York? The city's relative underperformance is theoretically interesting to me. Again, longest history of immigrant activism, the most immigrant rights organizations, the biggest immigrant population in the country. And as I'll talk about in a moment, a lot of undocumented, hundreds of thousands of undocumented immigrants in the city. Another interesting question about New York was why different immigrant groups mobilized to different degrees. Despite the diversity in the city's protests, despite the fact that all undocumented immigrants were going to be impacted by this bill, including some documented ones, organizers of various racial and ethnic backgrounds in the city told me that the rallies are surprisingly heavily Mexican and also heavily Dominican. So the Dominican participation might not be that surprising, given that they're the largest immigrant group in New York City. But as I'll explain in a few moments, the degree of Mexican participation was interesting and worth examining for several reasons. Lastly, with regards to coalitions, since at least the 1960s or 70s, both scholars and activists have consistently argued that multiracial solidarity and coalitions are vital for minority political empowerment. Yet there was also a growing body of literature at the time showing that rather than coalitions, it may actually be conflict and competition that's the dominant type of relationship amongst different racial groups. Nonetheless, I felt that despite this, when multiracial and ethnic coalitions do form, it's important for us to understand why and how, right? Especially those of us that are committed to forming them or building them. So what were my findings regarding these questions? My research shows that in the case of New York, the 2006 protests, the draconian and far-reaching nature of the Sensenbrenner bill was able to bring organizations and activists from a variety of different political as well as racial and ethnic backgrounds together to form these broad, diverse coalitions that coordinated their local protests, which again were probably the most diverse in the country. For example, Gwari Sequani of the New York Civic Participation Project said, HR 4437 criminalized whole sectors of our society that supported or in any way provided services to undocumented immigrants. It really challenged not just the people that were here without papers, that were undocumented, but in some ways our entire social fabric that allows for immigrants, regardless if they were documented or undocumented, to be part of our society. Hector Figueroa, a legendary union leader in New York, which unfortunately recently passed away, remembered, quote, the institutions and networks that we had put in place before, fighting police brutality, fighting for immigration reform, fighting for language access and city services, it was those networks that immediately connected people. But if local activists of various racial and ethnic backgrounds were united over the severity of this policy threat, why then did different immigrant groups in New York mobilize to different degrees? According to my findings, a major factor was the degree to which different immigrant groups felt threatened by the proposed legislation. For instance, one anonymous Eastern European immigrant activist told me, quote, there's an estimated 50,000 Russian Jews that are undocumented in New York. But when it comes to being attacked as immigrants, they really don't feel those attacks apply to them, right? This is at the time, partly because they're white. And he was a white European immigrant. Monami Malki of the largest Muslim South Asian organization told me, quote, it was much tougher to mobilize in the South Asian community and I think also in non-Latino communities because HR 4437 was very much seen as a Latino thing. The media promoted it as only a Mexican thing, so non-Latino stayed away. And Hayun Yoon of CAV, which is a big Asian immigrant organization, she recalled that many Chinatown residents felt that the Sensenbrenner bill just really didn't affect them. So despite the fact that all undocumented immigrants would have technically been impacted by the Sensenbrenner bill, many documented and undocumented immigrants in non-Latina communities and non-Mexican immigrant communities believe that this particular quote unquote anti-illegal immigrant bill didn't affect them. Right, I remember one organizer in Chinatown told me, our people in our communities that we mobilize with said, well, I didn't cross the border illegally. I just overstayed my visa 30 years ago, right? So they were thinking like, they didn't understand that being undocumented is undocumented. It doesn't matter how you become it, right? They just thought, well, this is a Mexican thing. They're the ones that cross illegally. Nonetheless, there were several factors that non-Latino immigrant activists said impacted their community's lack of participation. So for example, previous experiences in the US with the US government impacted certain immigrant groups. I don't know if some of you again might not remember this, but after 9/11, there was a program called special registration, where basically Homeland Security told thousands of Muslim immigrants, you have to come and register. And when they showed up, they were basically disappeared. Their families didn't hear from them for weeks. They had been deported. They didn't know where they were, right? That was terrifying for the Muslim community at the time. Their organizations, including Drum, were raided by the FBI's and all the computers were taken, right, with all the information of all the communities that they work with, right? So when I talk to the different Muslim organizers, they're like, we're trying to keep a low profile here. We're not going out to protest the government. We're terrified of the government, right? So previous experiences with the US government impacted some immigrant groups' willingness to come out. Also, previous experiences in their country of origins mattered, right? So for the first April 10th National Day of Action, the Chinese community came out strong, right? But then for the May 1st community, the Taiwanese community didn't show up. And when I interviewed activists, they're like, we were down to support immigrant rights, but May 1st is a communist holiday, so we're not going to support that. Mainland Chinese immigrants are like, yeah, we're all in for May 1st, But, right, that previous historical experience mattered. Same thing for immigrants from formerly communist East European countries. They're like, we were forced to go to rallies our whole lives. We're not going to a rally anymore here, right? This is part of us, our freedom of being Americans, not having to go to rallies. Third, the fact that different immigrant groups had different policy interests, I believe, also likely played a factor. African and Asian immigrant, for example, their organizations were really focused before this on clearing the visa backlog, right? So they were here technically, legally, they just wanted to be cleared and finally get, their residency. They didn't really talk much about or care much about deportations or border militarization. Nonetheless, according to local organizers in many of these non-Latino communities, even when these communities did have sizable numbers of undocumented immigrants, many non-Mexican immigrant communities didn't realize that their policy interests were going to be impacted by the Sensenbrenner bill if it were to become law. Again, they saw HR 4437 as only impacting Latinos in general, but Mexicans in particular. And as I argue in the chapter, I believe that these findings illustrate how certain immigration policies, in this case, those related to illegality, become racialized not only in the minds of the general quote unquote white American public, but also amongst different immigrant groups, right, themselves. And I think these findings may also help explain why Dominicans and Mexicans, as I mentioned earlier, seem to be overrepresented at the demonstrations. Moises Perez of the largest Dominican immigrant serving organization in the city recalled, Dominicanos are the largest immigrant group in New York, right? So he said this is why they came out, they were there. We remembered that there was a lot of Mexicans there. He says it was like, wow. This might not, again, be that surprising because immigrants are the largest Dominicans are the largest immigrant groups, but they did have a policy interest there. A series of laws, immigration laws, restrictive immigration laws that were passed in 1996 made a whole bunch of minor offenses into felonies just for immigrants. And they made them deportable and they made them retroactive, right? So there was a case in the Dominican community where I believe it was a pastor who was like 60-something years old, who had been in the United States the vast majority of his life. He got caught with like a joint or something when he was a teenager in New York. And because of that one offense, despite the fact that he was a pillar of the community, he was deported because that law was retroactive, right? And Dominicans were being disproportionately deported as a result of those 1996 laws, right? So they did have a stake in the game. They knew how the law, was impacting them and the importance of legalization. As this quote pointed out, though, there was a surprising significant amount of Mexican immigrants. A local South Asian activist recalled or described the marches as Mexican. Definitely Mexican, a lot of Mexican flags. So again, although this may not be that surprising to people from California, where Mexicans are the biggest immigrant group, the degree of Mexican participation in the New York City protests is actually challenges some of, again, established social science literature on political participation. Mexicans in New York City at the time were notoriously underorganized, right? There was tons of Dominican organizations, several Haitian organizations. There was no Mexican immigrant rights organizations at the time. The one kind of space in which they kind of hung out and did stuff with, as I'll talk about in a moment, is a Catholic church. Right, but again, social movement theory says that social movement organizations are important. That really didn't exist for these Mexicans in New York. Socioeconomic status, right, is highly correlated with political participation, even in activism. At the time, Mexicans had the lowest level of education amongst all immigrant groups in the city and the highest poverty rate amongst all immigrant groups in New York City. Yet, again, the crowd was definitely Mexican. There's also several quantitative studies that say even when Mexican or Latino immigrants do participate in protests, they're much more less likely to do so if it's in a new immigrant destination, which New York was for them at the time, right? They're more likely to come out in a place like LA, where there's a culture and there's a big mobilization, they'll feel safe and stuff like that, right? Yet, according to the director of the only Mexican-based or group, a Catholic Church organization in New York City, Brother Joel, said, usually for us to organize a mobilization, we have to set up a meeting. We have to explain to people in each community, in each church, what we're going to do, why we're going to do it, etc. But that year, we didn't have to mobilize. Mexican immigrants moved on their own. So as I found in my other case study cities, Mexican immigrants in New York, they didn't need to be reminded that the issue of illegal immigration was racialized as Mexican, right? Meaning that people of Mexican descent, both US and foreign-born, they understood really well that anti-illegal meant anti-them, right? And I think these results also help us understand why, compared to other major immigrant metropolises like LA, Dallas, and Chicago, New York City, again, relatively underperformed